And I'm Clinton.
And welcome to Black Atlantic. We are a podcast, website, and media channel with the goal of bringing Black East Coast voices to the world.
You can expect to hear from us every week with guests, segments, panels, or roundtables exploring topics from all over Atlantic Canada.
Also, be sure to visit our website at blackatlantic.ca.
And follow us at Black Atlantic on IG, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and more.
How have you been?
I've been great. How have you been?
I've been good. I'm
Amazing.
excited to speak to our guest this week because I have spoken to him twice before, so I feel very privileged to be bringing Gary Weeks to our show today. I had the privilege of interviewing him for our Black History Month segments with CBC, which we are super honored and privileged to do. And then I enjoyed our conversation so much that I thought By Blacks would really appreciate hearing what Black artists in the East Coast are able to do. And of course, we have wanted to have you on the show for a while. Took some time, but you are here. Gary, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. I'm all of a sudden just struck with a little bit of nervousness. All of a sudden, the cold sweats have started.
So oh my goodness. Yeah, that's how you know it's going to be a great episode, though. Yeah. So, no matter how many years you do this, get on a stage, do anything, those pre-show jitters are always great.
I will also add too that the reason that I know about you, and I always feel that I wish I knew more of the Black network of New Brunswick, because there's so many cool people doing so many different things. But I became aware of you when I was made aware of Greg Frankson, who was our first ever guest on the show, because of the African anthology that you did the cover. The photo is yours. And of course, Tondue, friend of the show, has some writing in there. And so it only makes sense to eventually have everyone who's participated with that project on our show. And that's how I came to know you and learned about all the amazing work that you were doing, and felt it was really important to feature you on the Black History Month special. I'll start though, so I know quite a bit about you, but I'd like you to tell our listeners, so you're from London, and I know that you spent some time in New York City, and I'm just curious if you'd like to tell our listeners what that upbringing was like and sort of the trajectory that got you onto a Canadian soil.
Yes. Well, hello, everybody, listeners. As I said, I'm Gary Weeks. I was born in London, England, to a family from Barbados. My parents are both Bajan. Dad's from St. Philip, Mum's from St. Andrew. And although I didn't visit the country until I was about 8 or 9 years old, I feel very much a Bajan. So growing up in London was a very, very wonderful place for me to grow up. I lived in just a local, they call it the projects or an estate. I came from a predominantly Black neighborhood in a place called Brixton. And all I remember growing up was an interesting drawing, but with no real direction. But I remember having that freedom to run and roam up and down the streets in London as a kid. Back then, we were in pretty rough war-torn neighborhoods. So there were what we call the Brixton Dump Gang, which I was a part of, where we would just run around collecting stones, throwing stones, building things, finding things, creating things. And it was just a very atypical childhood compared to what my kids had growing up. But again, it was very adventurous. There was lots and lots of adventures that we could have. So grew up in London, lived in London till I was 14 years old, did what we call primary school, secondary school. And as a 14-year-old, my school was about to change from an all-boys school to a mixed school. And that's when my parents sadly picked me up. And I've got 2 older sisters and a brother, younger brother. And we decided to emigrate to New York City. And that's where my father's family were living. So when we hit New York City was not a big jump from what we were doing as kids in England, because from one big city to another big city, the change is not huge. But in New York, the first thing I noticed was the heat. We went there in the middle of summer. I came there with these big lamb's wool sweaters that I wore looking the part in England, and realizing that I was just burning up in New York. But New York was a place where it was, again, more of an adventure, but more of an adventure with an edge. The edge was that you could feel like you could be hurt at any second, or you could be, we were playing around with a bunch of different stuff and gotten involved with the wrong people. But it was still very much an adventure for me, because I was always a comic book reader. And as a comic book reader and someone who drew comics as a kid, I had this idea of what New York was like, but I really knew even back then that I would never live in New York for the rest of my days. I knew that I was just visiting, so to speak.
Okay, that is super interesting. So growing up in London and New York, if you don't mind, I got a bit of a nice picture of what the things were like there. Did you experience, were you mostly around Black communities? Did you experience racism? Did you experience anything like that? Or were you able to avoid a lot of that during those years?
It was weird, because growing up in London, I was in a predominantly white neighborhood. We were one of two families that lived in our projects, in our estate. So we were all sort of lower middle class or just lower class. And it's funny that we talk about it now, because I've just come back from a trip. I hadn't been to England for 15 years. And I just recently returned after seeing my 90-year-old aunt. And the neighborhood that I lived in back then, it was amazing. It was terrifying on one hand, where you were careful to walk around as a kid, as a Black kid in this predominantly white area. But at the same time, I was a soccer player when I was a kid, and a very good one at that time. So I had this sort of aura about me because I played soccer, and all the kids in the neighborhood knew I was fairly good at soccer. So I was sort of left alone, and my family was always a very community-driven family. So we knew everybody in the area, or as many people that cared to know us. So I knew that there was racism around, and there was this organization called the National Front that was big when we were kids. And so there was always that possibility of things happening to me or to one of my family members. But luckily, we didn't really see anything, or I didn't see anything firsthand. I hung around with a lot of white guys and back then as a kid. So I was always the one Black kid in amongst a group of white kids. And so I held my own. I was considered to be a fairly good fighter when I was younger. So that was another thing that sort of stopped people from being overly aggressive or having attitudes towards me. But yeah, I was very aware of my surroundings, but I did not let my surroundings control what I did and where I went. And then when I went to New York was a different story, because I was now in a predominantly Black and Hispanic or Puerto Rican neighborhood. And in that Puerto Rican neighborhood that I lived in, you would not see any white faces. There was one white family that was in my neighborhood when I first got there, but they stayed there for maybe 2 or 3 years, and then they moved out and we never heard of them again. So that neighborhood was very different for me, because I'm now walking amongst Black people, but predominantly Spanish people. And at the same time, walking the same walk that I walked in London, which was one of sort of not caring or feeling like I was allowed to be here. And so when I went to high school in New York, if you can imagine, I came from an all-boys school in London, which was 800 people strong. And then I moved to a mixed school in New York, which was 3,000 people now. And I was seeing pregnant girls up and down the hallways. I saw what I considered men at that time with full beards. And so just that alone was strange and very different for me. But because I've always had a sporty background, I joined the American football team. And so straight away, I was surrounded by people that were my protectors, or people that, if they were bullies, they were now my teammates. And so I never got any flack from them or from that. In New York, there was racism. And the thing I say about New York is it's extremely divided. And so you'll have Black neighborhoods, you'll have white neighborhoods, Spanish, Chinese or Asian neighborhoods. And so you were told not to cross these sort of streets to go into other neighborhoods. And so as long as you stayed within your own neighborhood, you really didn't see too much from anybody else. But with that in mind, when I started working, what I tend to do is people watch. And so just traveling the subway from Lower Manhattan to the Bronx, I would see how the complexion of the train or the subway train changed as I went from Lower Manhattan to the Bronx. Downtown, it was a very mixed crowd. All the people that got on were working people. And so everybody filled the train with all nations. And then as you started hitting the major stops, 42nd Street, a few white people would step off, a few Black people would step on. You get to 86th Street, and now all of a sudden, you're getting, the next stop is almost Harlem. And so by 86th Street or 96th Street, all the white people would leave. And then the train would be filled with Blacks and Hispanics all the way up to the end of the line. So I noticed that as a kid and went, this is incredibly strange, because I grew up in a fairly mixed neighborhood. Even though there were a few Black families and there were majority white families, it was still pretty mixed. Whereas seeing the difference in New York, it sort of astounded me. And it's sort of left a mark on me, if I have to be honest with you. But at the same time, again, I looked at it as fodder for what I was intending to do, which was to create art and make art. And all these things that I've now experienced are somehow being fed back into my art, which is not a conscious thing, but it must be it's an unconscious thing that has been feeding me for forever, I'd say.
Well, that's the perfect segue, because I did want to ask, considering that amazing like upbringing and all of the cultures around you, and I will say my cousin's from New York, and I'm going to ask if she feels that it's the same, or if she's noticed that as well, because she's never mentioned this, like, I don't know, I picture it almost like a rainbow of browns that cascade through this, like, the subway. And I think that's so interesting. That's not how it is in Toronto. Yeah,
it's not. Yeah.
It's not. But I am curious, as you mentioned, like it was fodder for your creativity and your art. I'm curious at what point you started creating art, and eventually what led to you choosing as like photography as the primary medium, or if it's what I know you as, maybe it is not the primary medium, but I'm curious like how you ended up picking photography or working with that, and what led to that.
So with photography, I didn't start off as a photographer, because one of the things I say now is that in Black households, you had cameras, but not every Black household had a camera. And the camera used to be always this precious piece of equipment that was put on shelves and taken down for Christmas, for a holiday, and then put back on the shelf. So my entrances into art was as a high schooler. I could always draw and I could always paint, and I considered myself a good copier. So back in New York in the early 80s, they used to have album covers, or they used to have Levi jackets, which had like a rectangular panel at the back. And so what people would do would get me to paint album covers or graffiti or those sort of things on these back panels. And I had my little business at 16 years old, painting these jackets and painting pants and jeans and whatever with all these diagrams. I used to travel down to Lower Manhattan and hang out in the Village and go to all the art supply stores down there to pick up acrylic paint to use for my artwork. But then I realized after a while that waiting for paint to dry was just not my thing. I've got this patience thing or impatience thing. And so by waiting for one coat of paint to dry before you can put on another coat, I realized that when I was given the opportunity to take a photography class in high school as an elective, and it was something that I did not need. I just needed to have another credit before going to university. I decided to take photography. And all of a sudden, I realized that this is where I would like to be, because although I had what was called a Kodak Ectomatic camera, which was a plastic camera that my parents owned, I tried to do these incredible shots with this piece of equipment that, you know, upon reflection, was not up to the task. But I realized that the images that I saw were the images that I wanted to take. And the fact that I could not draw from memory, so to speak, I didn't have that brain control where I could just see something and put my spin on it. I decided that this medium, photography, speaks louder to me than the painting. And even with photography back then, with film, there was still this waiting, but it was a different sort of waiting. You weren't waiting for paint to dry, you were waiting for your film to be developed at the lab, and that would take 3 to 4 days before you would come back. You will pick up your film and you'll see all the mistakes you made after waiting for 4 days. But then there was this magic in that period of waiting that you don't get with digital, sadly. But that's how I started into film. When I say film, photographic film. And then I was given the opportunity to work in a camera store. We've got an equivalent store in Fredericton here called Harvey's Studios. And I work for a company called Times Square Cameras. And so what I was originally there for was just a counter person selling film and developing film for customers and selling the odd camera. But then they made me a manager, and now I was running the place as a 16, 17-year-old. And then I still looked at photography as something that I could do, possibly in the future, but I did not know how to get into professional photography. So what I would do is I would buy a camera, I'd walk around the neighborhood and I would take pictures very early in the morning. And I would take these pictures, which I would love to find right now. They're in some archive of mine, but just to see what I did as a 17, 18-year-old and how I saw the world back then. But it wasn't until I got the opportunity, or I was given the chance to have a job interview with a studio down in Lower Manhattan, that photography really became part of my life. I was given the job just basically on the say-so of a family friend of mine. And they knew I was interested in photography, but I did not know the equipment that they used, but they were still willing to take the risk. So I ended up working for this huge studio called Nobart, New York. And what we did was all the photography that you see in circulars like Canadian Tire, those things that end up on your driveway. We used to do the photography for those circulars, those flyers. And so it was an incredible learning period for me, because although I didn't go the traditional route of learning through a university or a college, I learned on the job. And I was surrounded by very creative and talented individuals, but they had to work within a brief, meaning that there was a certain way of photographing these items that you couldn't really deviate from there or put any artistic slant on it. But it was very, very good because you were just surrounded by creatives, which was something that was unusual for me up until that point. I was always the creative one in the room. So I stayed at this particular organization for, I think, 3 or 4 years. And we went through working originally, photographing tabletop items. We call them pack shots. And then we moved on to working with room sets. And in room sets, you've got people creating these fake rooms, and then photographers are there to light them. And one of the stories that I tell because I find it a fascinating one, was that there was one photographer that we were working with, and we did not know, we were photographing a model. And I always ask people, do you know the distinction between a negligee and a nightgown? And everybody says, yes, they know the negligee, the difference between a negligee and a nightgown. This particular model was wearing a nightgown, but the photographer, who was not used to photographing people, was so nervous when it came to communicating with this beautiful model, but in a nightgown, that I just stood there and went, wow, I just don't understand that. So as soon as the shot went off without a hitch, but just this interaction between the model and the photographer, I found unusual. When I got the opportunity to move down to the fashion floor, and the fashion photographers were just, yes, and just excellent with people, I thought, this is where I would rather be, because photographing inanimate objects is not my thing. Although I can do it, I'd rather work with the public and work with individuals. And at that time, I wanted to work with models, because models always knew that they were going to have their picture taken. So it always felt easier for me than to approach a stranger to ask them to have their picture taken. And so I went the model route, or the fashion photographer route, for a couple of years. Then I realized I'm not a fashion photographer. You have to live the life to be a fashion photographer. And I can take a good picture, but you won't see me on any runways. And so I enjoyed that part of it. But then when I decided that I was in New York for 10 years, and 10 years was a great time. It was from the time when I was 14 to 24, but I always knew that I was going to go back to England. And so when I was 24, I decided that I had this green card, which was a piece of gold back then, still is, I'd say, but it was a choice of going back to England. And if anything didn't happen to me photographically, meaning I would not get a job in the industry, or I would not get my foot in the door before the year was up, because it was the year that you needed, you had to stay out of the country for less than a year, otherwise you would have to relinquish your green card. So before the year was over, I managed to get a job in a photo store, again, similar to what we have here in Fredericton. And so it became that decision whether to go back to America and start my life there, or start my life in England. And I chose England, and I think it was the best decision that I ever made. So, I've left America. I did some university in America. I did some high school. I made a lot of great friends who I'm still in contact with. But I decided that England was my love. That's my home. So I'm going back to England. And so when I went back to England, I started working in this camera store, and then I ended up working for another camera store called Hasselblad. And in Hasselblad, that's where we started working with a lot of professional photographers, but we were behind the counter showing them how to use the equipment. But then I started getting the bug to start shooting, start doing more of my own work. And my work was very commercial, but at the same time, I always did something to the side, which was the art, the fine art work. So whenever I would shoot for clients and I would get paid. But then I would always go out on a weekend with friends or with colleagues, and we would find events around town. We would find street fairs. We would find all these things that were very British, very English, that we were able to attend as photographers and take as many pictures as we would like. One of the stories that I would like to add, I'm sorry about chopping back and forth, but when I was first in England and I stopped photographing models, because as I said before, models are very knowledgeable. They know that they're going to have their pictures taken, so there's that barrier torn down straight away. I decided that I was just going to start photographing people again. And so when I was heading out with a group of other photographers who were older than me, I was like the young black kid amongst all these white photographers. They would rush out the car and they would start taking pictures straight away. I remember rushing out the car and then having to stand there for 2 hours trying to build up the courage to approach my first person to do this street photography that I was very much into at that time. And I realized soon enough that I can't spend 2 hours waiting to take the first shot every single time I head out. So what I started to do was build that confidence up, started to have my little ways of getting people on my side. And so now I could jump out the car and start taking pictures straight away and coming away with something that I felt was very good. I always liked approaching subject matter slightly differently. So equipment was one of those things that I used, which was different to everybody else's. And so the equipment that I was using back then to do my street photography was not your conventional street photographer's equipment. It was not long lenses where you would stand across the road and photograph people from a distance. The equipment that I used was equipment that you had to be, for in my case, less than a foot away from them to photograph their portraits. And then I would stand no more than 10 feet away from them to shoot full length because I was working with a very wide angle lens. So what it gave me was this sort of superpower, so to speak, where behind the camera I could do anything. And I was very, very comfortable behind the camera to shout directions or introduce myself or walk up to people. But I'm not that sort of person in real life. Without a camera, I'm quite happy to sit in the background and not say much and just observe. So I always remember the power that the camera gave me and how the camera still gives me.
That's Go ahead, Hillary.
I want to share something really quick because I don't know why I didn't think to tell you about this before, but it's very silly. But I happen to have a somewhat of I'll call it a relic to me, but it's my first camera, but it is a Barbie 50th edition Polaroid that I won from YTV, a TV channel that I don't even think exists anymore in Canada. And I was looking for film for it today. And then I was like, oh, this is also coincidental, but this is my Polaroid Barbie from 1999.
You should look at this thing called the Impossible Project.
Okay.
Just Google Impossible Project, and they still sell film. The film is ridiculously overpriced now, but it's available.
Yeah. I was looking at Amazon, The Devil, and it was like $110 for just 40. And I was just like, oh. Wow. I mean, okay, but okay.
for the nostalgia of it all.
For like what, one summer in Toronto, but I would love to. So anyway, this is my relic.
The teenagers, for like my daughter and all her friends for the past 3 or 4 years, and I think she may have grown out of it, but they were all about those Polaroids, taking Polaroid pictures like crazy out and about with their friends, developing them, hanging them in their rooms. It was really neat to see that. And Gary, your story brought a lot of good feelings, but definitely some nostalgia when you mentioned about how you take the photos. You don't know what they look like. No. You got to wait 3 to 4 days to get them developed. And when I see photos from back in the day, even just not even professional, just growing up, I'm always marveled at how many of them are good, because it's just that in the moment shot and no one knows what it really looks like. And then you wait and you get it. And then it's good. It's good.
There, all those great pictures that I grew up with, watching and viewing and learning from, were all shot with film. You know, digital was not around. I was there when digital first happened.
Yep.
But and I'm saying to myself, we can get such incredible pictures with that quality of equipment. And now we're into whistles, bells, and buzzers, and cameras that are the size of plates in front of you. And yet you don't need all that. If you've got a good eye or you've got some skill, you can shoot 1 frame, 2 frames instead of 200 frames and still tell the same story.
Yeah, and digital was kind of gross when it first came out, wasn't it? I remember I'm old enough to remember my dad had got his first digital camera. It was maybe $3,000. I think it was. I don't even think it was on the megapixel scale. I think maybe it was 0.3 megapixels. Stored like 10 photos on a floppy disk.
Exactly.
Yeah, they weren't great.
I was working for a company called Hasselblad, or when I was working in New York when we first started doing digital. And the bodies were literally that tall. They're about 10 inches tall, because the drive that held all the digital information was this huge block that sat beneath it. Cameras were heavy, the quality, the resolution was terrible. And we always used to say, this will never work. We will never, we'll never
like
give
the
up.
internet, right? This will never happen.
Yeah. And
amazing.
now all of a sudden, it's crazy. And yeah, those expensive cameras, I was offered a few of them just recently. And there was, because they're sort of not real, digital doesn't have this realness. They weren't as appealing to me as the older mechanical cameras. So I passed on those, and I've got a wall full of, a bag full of just old-fashioned cameras from that mechanical age that I still love. And I can't wait to get back to using them again.
That's great. Let's get into Atlantic Canada. So you went from London to New York, back to, I think it sounds like a different world in London, to New Brunswick. Is that correct?
Yes. That was it.
What was it like? What was it like moving to Fredericton, New Brunswick, after living in these major metropolises?
So I met a girl that lived in Fredericton. So we had come to Fredericton before, maybe when we had our first child. We came to Fredericton and thought, yeah, Fredericton's cool. Came to Fredericton in the summertime. And so Fredericton was an amazing place compared to the cities that I lived in. But at that time, we were just visiting because we had no intention of emigrating. So we had 3 kids in total, 3 girls. All my girls are in their 20s now, moving on to their own lives and doing really, really well, which I'm very pleased and proud of. But it wasn't until we came up to that obstacle where my eldest was 12 years old, and she was planning on going to secondary school. But in England, secondary school is not around the corner, and we don't have school buses. So the option was that we were going to put her on a regular bus, and she would travel an hour and a half to school and back. We weren't at liberty to drive them because the amount of traffic on the road, it's quicker by bus than by car. And we had talked about coming to Canada because my family are all in New York a few years before, but we weren't really ready. And then all of a sudden we decided, okay, we're going to do it. So we bought the house, or the flat that we lived in, a small 2-bedroom flat where we raised 3 kids in one room and we were in the other room. And we purchased that, we fixed it up, and we essentially flipped it. And we made a lot of money on it, a lot of profit. And that money brought us to Canada. And we came to Fredericton because her parents were Frederictonians, or her father was. And so we were closer to her family, but also not a stone's throw from my family in New York. So we came here, I came here for love, I guess. But the love didn't last, which is another story unto its own. But Fredericton was an amazing place, and I still find Fredericton amazing. I could not believe the people in this city. First, let me talk about the people. In London, even when I went back there on this most recent trip, the thing about London is that you don't see the elderly on the roads after a certain time of day. They get up in the morning, and when the kids are in school now at 9 o'clock, you'll see all the elderly shopping in London till about noon, because that's when there's a lunch period. As soon as the kids come out out of school at lunch, all the elderly disappear, and now they're sort of locked inside their homes until the next day, because it is terrifying for an older person to be out on the streets of London when there's a bunch of school kids around. There's always the threat of something happening. So when I came to Fredericton, I was amazed at the fact that there were all these people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, running around, walking, going to theaters, going to restaurants, going to clubs, that at that late stage of their lives without a care in the world. The people that were surrounding them were not frightening them or intimidating them in any way. So I thought, wow, I could live in a place like this, because that constant fear does create tension and stress within your body. So that was the first thing I noticed about Fredericton. Second thing I noticed was just how clean it was compared to the cities and the smells and the noise and the hustle and bustle. I'm not part of that anymore. I've grown up in there. I can function quite well in a city, better than I can in the countryside, I'll tell you that much. But I realized that for me as a parent, I'm trying to give my kids the best possible start. And so the best possible start for them would be in a place like Fredericton, rather than a place like London or a place like New York. If they want to, they can discover those places when they get older. But now giving them the best possible opportunity is what I'm here for. And that's what my ex-wife was here for, to do. And so I think we achieved that. And now the kids are, as I say, successful, and they're doing the right thing, as far whatever that right thing may be. So Fredericton was great for me, but then Fredericton was also very strange for me, because it was, again, it wasn't even predominantly white, it was very white. And my ex-wife, she's white, and so we had all of her family that we could call on, but we didn't really call on her family for not much of anything. But we and my family were in New York, and I've got one relative in Hamilton, Ontario. But we were essentially on our own. And so I was amazed at the fact that I could not get a haircut anywhere. And then I was amazed at the fact that I would see, I lived just outside the city. And because I was just outside the city in a little village called New Maryland, you didn't see really that many black faces, and you could go for days, weeks at a time. If you didn't leave the neighborhood, you wouldn't see anybody from anybody else that looked like you. We had a great family across the road, an African family, who I'm still in contact with, even though I've left the neighborhood in close to 10 years now. But it was just that day-to-day contact. Coming from London, where I worked amongst Black people, my family, a lot of my family were there, to nothing was the biggest shock for me. But as I say, I tend to function well everywhere, or at least I like to think I do. So although it was different, I sort of decided that I was going to make the most of it. And I think I have made the most of it, even though there are times when I feel I could be making more of it.
I think we think that you've made the most of it, considering we know who you are and things are going really, really well for you. But I'm very curious, because I hope I don't offend anybody, but I don't think I know that many photographers in New Brunswick who are doing as many cool and interesting things as you are. It could be the Black factor, that I know all of the work that you're doing and it's so interesting and captivating. But I imagine, was it difficult when you first came to Fredericton with like photography in mind? Like, did you start out thinking, I'm going to pursue photography full time here in Fredericton? Did it take a long time? And did you face any like backlash as a Black photographer? Did anything like that ever happen? Or was it like open arms, all of the opportunities, then that's how you got to be on our podcast?
Well, I would say all that and more. I didn't feel any backlash, but I did feel that I could not charge the same as my contemporaries. Maybe that's just me, maybe that's the industry, but I felt that I could not charge the same. Otherwise, I would not get the work. And so I grew up with, amongst other photographers, saying, you've got to keep your prices high, you've got to keep your prices high, because it devalues, otherwise it devalues the industry. And I was always cognizant of that. But at the same time, in practice, I would do a lot of volunteer work. I would do a lot of work that was done cheaply compared to some of the prices that I saw people of lesser skill than I, or at least what I felt was lesser. And so I think that was the major thing. But when I first came to Fredericton, I thought to myself, I'm going to do this photography thing. One of the things I talk about is when it came to the birth of my first kid, and it was the birth certificate that we had to sign, what's your profession? I was working as a sales assistant in a camera store, but I turned to my girlfriend who became my wife, or who since became my ex-wife. So I turned to her and we were like, why don't you just put photographer? And I went, I can. And I said, yes, I'll put photographer. And so straight away I thought, it's on the birth certificate now, I have to live up to that title. So I first started taking pictures at my local church. And again, even in that environment, I did a lot of work for free. And I hoped people would come see me and have their family photos taken, but I didn't get a lot of that. And I'm not sure if it was just my lack of advertising or my lack of screaming from the rooftops that I do this as a regular thing, but I didn't get a lot of work from them. And so what I decided to do one day was to take up teaching. I was given the opportunity to teach. And so I started teaching at the local college, which was called the Center for Arts and Technology. And I was the head of the photography department. And even then I found it very difficult, because what we learn and how we shoot in England is very different to how they shoot in Fredericton. So what I was doing was bringing that sort of attitude to my class. And it was all well received, but then there was a year that it wasn't as well received. And so the person that was that took over from me shot very differently, and still very good, but very different to what I did. And so I would say I felt that there was a wall, but it was one of those unwritten walls that you had to toe the line. You had to stay within the confines of what they felt was good, or what they felt was acceptable. And because I did not really subscribe to that attitude, I don't think I was as easily accepted as others. So what I tended to do was bounce around. So I did a lot of freelance work, and I worked photographing animals, I worked photographing buildings, architecture, I photographed portraits, I photographed weddings. I did a little bit of everything just to keep the money coming in, but at the same time telling people, this is what I do and this is how I do it. And so I gained a certain level of respect in the industry for that reason alone. But it wasn't until I started to seriously push that things started to happen. But again, people are not as inclined to use a Black photographer in the commercial sense before, I would say, the George Floyd incident, or tragedy, I should say, sorry about that. And now all of a sudden, since that happened and Black Lives Matter movement started in earnest, I feel that was some contributory factor to where I am today. But at the same time, I think I was asked the question by a friend today, and I think it was down to hard work and a lot of good fortune. Because I sometimes feel I come across as non-threatening, I tend to get into places where I would not necessarily get, but I always feel that I am very, very diplomatic is the word I'm starting to use right now. And with that diplomacy, I can sit and talk to most people, and most people will get on my side. And so I can ask for things that the next person may not be able to ask for. But it's a process. It's a process. It's a process of me living in the city and working amongst wealthy individuals and very poor individuals, and then doing the same in New York. and just being able to straddle those divides. You know, we talk about code switching, and I guess I code switch a lot. But I think that's what I needed to be the person that I am today. And again, I'm not code switching, or I'm not being a very different person. All I'm doing is making the person feel at ease with me so that I can get the most out of them and they can walk away with a good experience.
Yeah. Thank you for stating all that. There was a lot of amazing insights in that one answer, as well as a bit of emotion shared. And I can certainly relate to you being a salon owner in a city where, you know, people who own salons just don't look like me. And when we reopened, I remember, you know, for years there, we know that we kept our prices lower than other places, not because our team members' work was of any less quality, but out of a fear that people maybe wouldn't come to us if we didn't charge what we were worth. And it can degrade the industry, and it's not the right thing to do. And it took years for us to realize that, you know, that's not the way to be. Also, you're talking about code switching, and that actually should probably be an episode all in its own, Hillary. Some of us code switch to survive. I think a lot of us subconsciously code switch. It's just a survival tactic that's ingrained into a lot of us in this society. So yeah, there's the pros and the cons and the arguments that you never should code switch. But as long I've always felt that as long as you are not changing maybe your ethics, your morals, your values, maybe if you're changing just the words you use a little bit or the way you approach different people, that's just a part of being an outgoing person and getting things done. Did you want to add something there, Gary?
Yeah, because when I went back to England after not being there for 15 years, I was with my cousins, and my cousins are Jamaican, so my first cousins are half Jamaican, half Bajan, half from Barbados, whereas their cousins are full Jamaican, if there's such a thing. Sorry, I don't know. But I straight away drifted into patois. And as soon as I walked through the door, I was like, what am I saying? Why am I saying this? But it just flowing out of me. And then a couple of days later, I'm hanging out with my old friend that we grew up with, and he's the white guy from London. And all of a sudden, I'm speaking "Cor blimey, mister," and using curse words. And again, I'm like, what am I doing? And I notice it because I'm making them comfortable. I'm making this guy comfortable. At the same time, it's still me in both instances. I'm still saying the same things. I'm still making the same jokes. But it's a skill that I guess portrait photographers or people who work with the public have. When you have someone sitting in your chair, you take on their persona, so to speak, just so that they're comfortable, and you try to talk about subject matter which will entertain them and appease them. Whereas, you know, I know a lot about many different subjects, but I don't know anything in depth, because I deal with many different types of people.
Yeah. And I'm reflecting as you speak. I wonder if it's something we can control, that you don't even notice it sometimes. It's just, where you just, anyways, okay. That was very insightful. I like that. So this year, sorry, actually, I want to speak about another thing. I think there's a lot to be said too about, since the murder of George Floyd, there have been a lot more opportunities for Black people. And I think rightfully and righteously so. I think this is a really interesting period in time where, I'm not saying you or me or Hillary, but people who are deserving and or maybe found themselves in not getting as many opportunities, but have the skill sets and qualities, or finding themselves in lower economic situations. Again, I'm not talking about us, but anyone. It's a chance for, I've seen a lot of Black people really raise their status, start new businesses, get those loans, have those opportunities. And I think this is a monumental shift in where if Black people do the right things, the ones who hadn't been getting opportunities, they can really set something up generationally for their families and families to come, people who haven't had access to opportunities. So I'm glad that happened for you. And it's been an interesting switch in narrative in society that I don't know if this wave is going to settle, if this is the start of something new where we'll see a bit more equalization. And I have a question for you, but I think you want to add something again.
Yeah, well, I would add to that, like, with all those good things that have been given towards the Black community and to myself in particular, there's still this level of, you do have to still come up with the job. You still have to be the best you know, because there's more pressure now than there was before. I was given an opportunity by CBC, and at first I was like, why did I get this opportunity? And I there's some merit there, but it may have been because of what was happening at the time. But I still had to come up with the best possible picture for their story, or for their entertainers, or for their media people. And but I felt that there was almost more pressure on me now, because I've been given this opportunity in the wake of the George Floyd murder. And so I have to step up, because, you know, bottom line, people, there's this still whole swath of people who believe that it was not an unjustified killing, whereas I fully am aware that it was ridiculous. I'm getting my words confused there, but basically,
I think everyone knows what you mean. Everyone knows what you mean. Absolutely. Yeah. Were you going to say something?
I was going to say, before you ask your question, that I would just like sympathize that, like, I think I won't fully speak for Clinton, but I definitely feel the same pressure every time we're asked to do something for Black History Month or Emancipation Day or any partnership with CBC or anybody, that, like, I wish there was this understanding that I'm not a monolith. I don't represent all Black people. And yet there's the feeling that if I don't prove to our white community that we deserve these spaces will be gone. And if I don't take some of this space, then there's no representation. And how can I share this space with other people in the Black community? Which is why we have a podcast. But it's a very big snowball effect of, it's a lot of complicated feelings when you end up partnering with people, and maybe sometimes feeling like you're a diversity quota mark, but wanting that to stay, because that diversity should be there. I can be your one little line in that check mark. You do add more, put me there, but add more too, I think is my
add more
big
too.
feeling. Yes.
I'm quite comfortable being there. But I know that there are other people behind me that are just as comfortable, and they will bring something, a different flavor that I bring. Like I say, I'm sort of non-threatening. So let's put someone up there that's threatening and give them the same level of attention, and let them show the world. Because, you know, in the white community, it's been happening for a long, long time. And those threatening white people are being accepted as sort of pioneers and tellers of truths. And I find that to be quite ridiculous at times.
And in the end, every dollar that goes towards, you know, our communities and our families, again, that is hopefully setting people up for the future, the generations to come. But on that note, I do want to ask you, this year you became the first Black person to have an exhibition at the Beaverbrook Gallery, and I saw those photos online, and it was awesome and very exciting for us to see. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like for you, and a little bit about what the Beaverbrook Gallery is for our listeners that have never heard of that before?
So firstly, the Beaverbrook Gallery, I should have looked at their website, but they're an internationally known art gallery. They've got works. Their most prestigious piece is by Salvador Dali, and they've got this wonderful exhibit, or they own 4 pieces of Dali in their collection. But then they've got British artists from all over the world. I'm not the best person to talk about the Beaverbrook, I'm afraid.
It's okay.
But at the same time, they're a phenomenal gallery. And they're an anomaly in this area, because they're a world famous gallery in this small town of Fredericton, New Brunswick, which no one has heard of. And yet the quality of work, the quality in their collection is that rivals other galleries, such as the Museum of Modern Art or the Tate Modern in England. So it's incredible that we've got such a space in our small city.
What was it like? What was the feedback like? What were the guests that came to see your work? We opened
it's really strange as well. So the backstory between how I became part of the gallery was during COVID. During COVID, I had my first sort of major exhibition at the Gallery on Queen, who now represent me. And Nadia Corey, the gallery curator owner, we decided to put together an exhibition by the New Brunswick Black Artists Alliance, which I am one of the founder members of, amongst others. And we decided that we were going to have this exhibition to celebrate Black History Month. But at that time, we weren't ready. But I was ready with a body of work that was luckily accepted into the gallery. So instead of it being a group show, it became a solo show with just my pieces. And I was showing work that was very different to what's at the Beaverbrook right now. So I had collections or parts of work from a Skull and Bones exhibition that I did, a solo show, one that was called History on Your Hands, which was another solo show. Icescapes was another. And so with these three bodies of work, we were able to put on quite a decent showing at the gallery. One of the guys at John LaRue from the Beaverbrook saw that work and wondered who it was and why hasn't he heard of this person before. And in honesty, I was a commercial photographer and I was looking back at some of my pictures and I'd photographed John LaRue 5 years, 6 years prior to us actually meeting formally as part of the Beaverbrook. And so Fredericton's a very small town, so everybody knows me, but I guess not everybody knew what I did. And so from the strength of that gallery showing at the Gallery on Queen, the New Brunswick Black Artists Alliance was asked to partner with the Beaverbrook on a project which we were wanting funding for. So the project was to shine a light on the Black artists in their collection. But as they started looking through their collection, they realized that they didn't really have that many Black artists represented in their collection. They had a few white artists who had photographed Black or had painted Black subject. And we were like, Then they had Americans who they owned one or two pieces of. And again, we were like, we're a Canadian gallery. Where is all the Canadian Black artists? And so it was something that they couldn't answer. But when we were looking through their collections, I saw pictures that I knew. And these were the work of Larry Fink, who's an American photographer, who put together a book called Boxing, which is here. And the pictures that the gallery owned came straight out of the book. And I was like, wow, how did you manage to get these? And so the gallery said that they were donated to them. And as soon as we realized that we weren't able to get this show off the road, all of a sudden I was asked by John LaRue if I would curate Larry Finks's work for a possible show. So I was like, yeah, it's the first time curatorial job that I was going to be doing. So I said, yeah, I'll jump at it, and I'm up for any challenge. But then at the same time, I said to myself, I've got pictures that I feel are just as good as Larry's, and I'll mention them to John. So I mentioned them to him. He asked me if he could see the pictures. We set up a lunch, and I showed him 150 pictures that were of my boxing project. And he went through 30, 40 of them and went, this is fantastic. And then he suggested, how would you like a show? And the story I'm telling everybody was that in the back of my mind, I knew that we should have a show, and I'd already figured it out. It was going to be Larry versus Gary. It was going to be his photographs get opposed in opposition to my photographs. And when he said yes, how would you like to join the two exhibitions together? I leapt at the idea, and I thought this was fantastic. So we originally decided that we were going to have the exhibition in January the 13th. But COVID has been either the best thing in my life or the worst thing in my life, because a lot of good things that I've done over the last 2 or 3 years has happened mainly during COVID. And so we tried to open the gallery, because the gallery has been closed for 2 years for some major renovations. It's an incredible looking space. It was an incredible looking space then, but now it's going to be much more incredible. So the idea was that we were going to start in January 13th. COVID put paid to that, because all of a sudden we went from yellow back to red. And so we had to close down everything. All the theaters were closed, all the galleries were closed. So instead of the gallery just saying, okay, you've missed your opportunity, they were incredibly courageous and said that we'll put it on in April the 2nd. And instead of it being in January for 2 months, it will be in April for 3 months. The space that I had before, where it would have been just me and another exhibition, their recent acquisitions, would be the only things being shown at the gallery at that time. It turned into this big event where they've got work by artist called Ruapel, who's a Canadian abstract artist who's on par with Jackson Pollock. And then they had various works by other contemporary artists and a couple of photographic projects, which are still there, and I would invite everybody to go see those. But now all of a sudden I've got this new space, which has been given to me. I've curated Larry Finks's work and deliberately chose just the black fighters because they would offset against the white fighters that I photographed. Larry Finks's photographs were of professional boxers. So you had a Mike Tyson there, you had Razor Ruddock, you had Larry Holmes, who all went on to world titles and world recognition. And then you had my fighters, who were just amateur boxers from New Brunswick, there was one guy who's got aspirations of becoming a professional and becoming a welterweight or a middleweight champion. So I've got pictures of him in his early days. We got one guy that was a hockey player, but he was an enforcer as a hockey player. And so he came to the gym to brush up on those fighting skills, which I did not know that these guys actually worked to brush up on these skills. So they had another fighter, and then there was another fighter there from my 3 fighters. That was a UFC fighter who now was just moving away from UFC and started wanting to do more of a pro boxing career. So we had all these differences, and I call it the similarities of difference, that my work could sort of oppose Larry's work. And so there's this constant back and forth of what he does as opposed to what I do. And the way we decided to present these images were, because Larry's work was shot in the early 90s, it's done on film conventionally, whereas all my work was done digitally. All of Larry's work was printed on traditional paper, silver gelatin paper. And so we put that work in frames. We call it under glass, I call it under glass. And me personally never liked showing my work under glass, because the story I always tell is that people in the past have taken work out of frames that photographers have painstakingly chosen to match their work, and decided to put it in a frame that matches the color scheme of the room. So I've never wanted that as a photographer, or not as a fine art photographer. So what I did was I printed my work on canvas, and to make my work just that little bit different, because my fine art work does tend to be a little bit different than the mainstream, I decided to make these canvases look like they'd just been cut from the boxing ring. So I stitched sort of tarp lines, I put grommets on them, I hung string from them, And I just hoped that people would understand what I was trying to do. So this, if we get back to when I was first asked about this exhibition, John LaRue saw the pictures, but I always told him from the very beginning that they're not going to be printed in that conventional manner. And he was like, okay. And so it wasn't until they'd already committed to the exhibition, they were already committed to the space, that I showed them how I present my work. And it was always that first initial glimpse of, what is this? And then all of a sudden you see it's hit them and you go, oh, now I understand. And that's the sort of resonance that I want my work to have. For some reason, the boxing photos established that and achieved that straight away. But that same sort of, I would like to have in my other work. And I desperately try to put that feeling into some of the other stuff I do.
I like that it's sort of a recurring theme with you, that you're trying, like everything you're trying to do different than everybody else, and in this creative way. Like, you're like, photos aren't going to be hung and framed like normal. I want to manipulate the scene differently, and I'm going to shock and awe people with that, in the same way that you weren't using conventional tools and you were going up closer to the people. And it's a very interesting thread throughout your life. And on behalf of both of us, congratulations on being the first person. I know I've said it before because I got to interview you about it before, but I think it's both. It says something that it took you to be the first, but I'm so happy that you are the first. And I think that everyone who knows you is obviously, I mean, it feels great to know someone who's been able to get such an amazing accolade like that. I will also shout out that we have while you're at the Beaverbrook Gallery looking at Larry versus Gary, our friend of the show, Meredith Batt, who wrote a book about Lennon Cub and the first queer. Yeah, so you can see that at the same time. Meredith has very kindly supplied us with a lot of archival information about Black people in New Brunswick so that we could bolster our Black history knowledge. Very great friend and ally of mine. I've known Meredith for 7 years, so it's exciting that you both had your exhibitions open at the same time.
See, I never even knew the connection, so that's fantastic, because I love the Lennon Club pictures, because they're a moment in time, and it's it's a wonderful story. But would they tell the same story about Black individuals in that time? And so I'm like, there's one part of me that loves the exhibition, and I do. But I'm thinking to myself, geez, if only we could tell the stories of us back in that same period, and have that sort of documentation around us. Because one of the things that we lack is just images of us just being ourselves 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And I think we need that, because it gives us an identity, it gives us a sense of belonging. We've been here in Fredericton for over 300 years, or in New Brunswick, I should say. And so for them, the gallery not to have any Black art, I find incredible. And I share and echo your thoughts, because for me to go from London to New York, back to London, to eventually end up in Fredericton, just to be the first person to be in that gallery is ridiculous. I should not be the first person. I should be one of many, or I could be the first British, English, whatever person, but not the first Black person to be in that gallery. So I've looked at it and I've thought about it, and I love the fact that I've been given the opportunity, but I still want the Beaverbrook to know, and I've told them so, that I should not be the first, and there should be other people after me. So I'm trying not to ruffle the feathers too much, because there are a lot of people that I'm pulling through.
Yeah, it's like when the artist 180 became the first Black artist ever in the history of New Brunswick ever to win any award with their organization. It's something to celebrate, but it also poses the question, well, how could he be the first? Yeah.
And when was that, if you don't mind me asking?
2021.
This, oh yeah.
Sorry?
2021.
2021.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Clinton interviewed him for the Black History Month episodes of CBC as well when I interviewed you at the same time. He had just won for that previous year for Music New Brunswick.
And let's be stereotypical here. For all the things Black people are not known for and should be known for, you think that in music, because there are some amazing Black artists that have been in New Brunswick for decades.
Yes.
Well, I look at it as it not allowing people to dream. So with art, and art to me means that you can imagine yourself in a different world, a different space, and you can show that quality to others. But when you're given no opportunity to show that to your fellow people, I find that incredible, because it just stops it dead in the tracks, and people sort of feel, well, there was an artist before me, so why should I become an artist? There wasn't musicians before me, so why should I become a musician? And it needs recognition. It needs people to scream from the rooftops that we are the first, but we shouldn't be the first in 2000s. We should be the first 100 years before.
Absolutely.
Before we wrap up this episode, I do want to ask you what is next. You've accomplished being the first Black person in New Brunswick to be in this gallery, and I'm sure you're not going to stop there and do many more things. What do you have any other artistic photography related or non-photography related plans in the future?
What I want to do from this exhibition is that I want a book from it. So I want to have a book, and it can be a Larry Fink, Gary Weeks book, or it can be just the Gary Weeks book, but using these boxing photographs to show in one concise book what I do. But that's one thing that I'm putting out there, and if you know people that will publish a book, I will definitely speak to them.
I do know. I worked for the company that exports all books internationally for like Heritage Canada. I know lots of people. Yes.
That's good.
Yeah.
But the one thing I want to do is keep expanding on the fine art work. The fine art work is something that I have been doing since day one. And so I've got a backlog of images that I would love to show the world. I still want to do some of the commercial work that I do, but I want to be a bit more picky and choosy about what I do. And also just change. I've got grant requests right now in the offering. So I'm just waiting for grants to come through. So that will sort of help me pursue my next endeavor as a fine artist. But in the meantime, I'm just a commercial photographer. I'm almost too down to earth with what I do. I think what I do is amazing. I really enjoy what I do, but I don't think it's earth-shatteringly changing. I feel it's what I do and what I enjoy doing, and through my teaching, I try to bring as many people into photography, because I've had a wonderful time, over 40 years of enjoyment being a photographer. So if I can keep bringing people into photography, I can keep making money to survive with my commercial photography, and then at the same time still do my fine art work, then that is a good life for me. I want to spend part of my time in Canada, part of my time in Barbados now. So Barbados will be my next stop. And so I'm trying to figure out whether or not I can do my fine art work in Barbados as well as here in Canada. The fact that I'm represented by the Gallery on Queen, I'm hoping that I can move them to spur them on to sell more of my work, to get me more established, so that it will leave me able to do more things. I want to have a show at the Tate Modern, because when I was in London, I visited the Tate Modern, and I remembered that I was, as a working photographer, I used to shoot for the Tate Modern. So I used to take pictures of artists showing their work at that venue. And so I would like to be in that venue now as a fine art photographer instead of just a commercial photographer recording the day. And so I've still got 101 different ambitions, but all my ideas come from all these different sources. And so there's not one clear and concise path that I will take. I will go this way before going this way and then go back that way.
Wonderful. Well, we're so thankful that we finally got to have you on the show, and I'm thankful that you've signed up for 3 different interviews with me, and I hope that you're satisfied with all of them. If anyone wanted to learn more about your work or your photography, where would they find that information?
So you could find me on the web at Weeks Photography. That's WEEKES photography.com. I'm on Instagram now as GWeeks, and Facebook, it's Gary Weeks. And so, yeah, please get in contact with me. Please ask me to take more pictures, more different pictures, because as we've found out, I do not think conventionally. Out of the box is what I'd rather be.
Go to the Beaverbrook Gallery if you are in Fredericton and see this exhibition. We're so excited about all of this. Clinton, final words.
It was great to have you on the show. You're a very insightful man, and just hearing you speak has given me so many ideas for future topics for the show, and possibly even blogs, just the different areas of life and reality that you touched on. I found inspirational, and I think our viewers will too. And also, yes, follow Gary Weeks and ask him to take more photos.
Yes.
I'm a simple man, so
yes.
I will never be rich, I will never be famous, but I will enjoy the journey immensely.
Well
Sometimes
said.
that's all you need. That's all you need.
Yep.
That's all I want. Yeah, I'm yeah. Speak to friends of mine, they'll say that I'm not driven by just monetary reward, but it needs to happen, because, as I say, it allows me to do other things where being strapped for cash does not.
Yep.
Speaking of, we have a GoFundMe, and so if you're listening, support our GoFundMe. Go visit the Beaverbrook Gallery. Follow us at Black Atlantic on all social media. Listen to the podcast. Cropberry, Clinton Davis. Is that all?
I think that's it.
That's it. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you, Clinton. Thank you, Hillary. It's been great speaking to you again.
And thank you, Gary.
Much success with Black Atlantic.
Thank you so much.